Hello, everybody, and welcome to Cinema Theology. I am Marit Cortez, and I am joined by
Josias Flores. We're so happy to have you again. Actually, this is our first episode that we are video recording, and so this is an exciting time for us.
Exactly. And we're very excited about a lot of things as well, because this is also the first time we've done this podcast seeing each other face to face, not through, FaceTime or Zoom. So This is an exciting time, so be excited with us today. And we are also very excited about the movie, the film, which we are reviewing and which we are analyzing. So Josias, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so this one may be a little controversial for some people. I don't personally have any problems with it, and I don't think you do either, because we're doing this together. We have decided to tackle The Two Popes. It's a Netflix film. I'm not sure who it's starring, and I should know that Anthony Hopkins is in this movie.
Okay, I'll tell you who it is. So it's the main two guys, because it's basically two people the entire movie.
Basically.
It's Pope Francis, or Jorge Bergoglio, played by Jonathan Pryce, and the Cardinal Ratzinger, or Pope Benedict, who is played by the illustrious Anthony Hopkins.
It's like you like him or something.
I really like his work, and I really like both of their work in this movie. They actually both got nominated for supporting and for Best Actor as well. And you really can see why, because the conversations that they have in this movie are so engaging. Even though this is basically a film about two people talking for 2 hours, you're just glued and you're just engaged the entire time. And that is in no small part because of the work that the actors do.
Agreed. They do a marvelous job with their acting. And I think also if you are someone with a religious bent, it's easy to be engaged on that level as well. Even if it is a different denomination, a different belief, you still kind of relate to some of the tensions that are in the movie. Anyway, at least that's the way that I've perceived from people that have watched this movie, from both of us as well.
Yeah, definitely. Because you and I are pastors, we're not part of the Catholic Church per se, but we kind of see some of these issues pop up in the Adventist Church, where we both have worked and we're now studying in seminary. So I think we have a lot to say about this. But why do we have a lot to say about this? What is this movie about?
Okay,
you want to take a crack at it?
Sure. Usually you are the synopsis fiend, but this time I will try to take care of this. And so basically this movie begins by the election of a new pope, right? So Pope John Paul II has died, legendary pope maybe for some. And what ends up happening is, all the cardinals engage in the process of choosing a new pope. That happens in the Sistine Chapel. Incredible, by the way. You got to go there in person. And anyway, so there's this kind of tension between Bergoglio and Ratzinger, which are the two leading cardinals, it seems, as
the two main candidates.
Two main candidates to become the next pope. And so what ends up happening is Ratzinger becomes the pope, and then you kind of fast forward, and then you have sometime in the future Bergoglio is looking to retire, and he goes and talks with now Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict has a number of conversations with him, talks about science, talks about religion, and ultimately lets him know that I feel God has called you to become the next pope. I'm going to abdicate, which is kind of huge for the Catholic Church. And anyway, that ends up happening, and Bergoglio gets chosen or voted as the next pope by the cardinals, and that's kind of where the movie ends.
Basically, yeah. So in being a movie about two popes, two people that ultimately were pope at some point in history, there's a lot to be said about what makes a good leader. In this case, basically the right hand of God in the Catholic Church.
In the Catholic Church, it's like, this is the voice of God,
Basically. But we see, there's a lot of politics involved behind all of this, and there's a lot to be said about what makes a great leader. And I think one of the most interesting quotes from this movie is where Bergoglio basically tells Pope Benedict, when Pope Benedict tells him, I want you to be the next pope, he says, no, I don't want to be pope. And Pope Benedict is like, but that's the first qualification. So I don't know. What do you think? Is wanting to be a leader, is a desire for leadership something that goes against you being qualified or called by God to be a person in leadership?
I think I kind of agree with what Pope Benedict says there. If you are seeking a position of authority in the church, at least honestly for me, when people are in that position of wanting leadership, it kind of gives me a moment of hesitation, because what I've seen and what I see in the scriptures, what I see from Jesus and from the other biblical, let's say, heroes that have led and had positions of authority, they usually were not looking for this position. God kind of speaks to them, and a lot of times you see this theme of, actually, not me, God. Like, you have the wrong person. Like, I'm not qualified. I can't speak, or I'm too young. There's just a number of things that people don't see themselves as in that position. But that's why God, in some sense, chooses them, because they're more moldable and more willing to listen to what he has to say, rather than have their own ideas and agendas when they come to positions of authority. That's my take on that. And so I do agree that humility is fundamental to being put in a position where you have influence, religious influence, spiritual influence over others.
Definitely. I think when we look at the greatest leaders in Scripture, you may see that at the beginning, when God originally called them, they may have been hesitant, maybe like Bergoglio was here in this film. Let's look at the example of Moses, perhaps the greatest leader, arguably in the Bible, who, when God comes to him in the burning bush, he tells him, you're going to liberate my people. And Moses is like, no, they won't listen to me. I'm not good at speaking, yada, yada, yada. And God is like, but you can, so go. And I think this is a common thread, because you also see in the story of Gideon as well. Gideon is kind of like, he's unsure of himself, and being able to lead God's people in rebelling against the Midianites. You see this kind of in the story of Jeremiah, the story of Isaiah. You see that there's always the starting point of humility. And I think for God, he finds a humble person more easier, or a better person to work with, than someone who has pride within them. In the sense that when we empty ourselves of pride, of desire, of letting, and when we empty ourselves of our desire for power or our pride, it's when God can come into our hearts. And if we invite him to come into our hearts, God can use us to do great things. Not necessarily be a leader, but God can use you for many things, but definitely leadership. I think humility is a great part, and I think it's something we should look for in our leaders, whether it's on a church level, or it's on your local county, or whatever, So
whatever level of authority you may be
exactly.
at.
Exactly.
I think, just kind of adding to that, and Dido, I really appreciate your comments, or maybe not adding to, but continuing on the same thread, maybe we should say, is I think the focus, when you are seeking a position of leadership, you're focused on yourself. Mm-hmm. When you're not, and when you're surprised by the fact that maybe you could be that person, maybe God calls you, or other people, invite you to that, and you weren't expecting it, it shows that you weren't focused on yourself. Uh-huh. Right? Your vision was focused elsewhere. And I think that's kind of the key of humility, right? That when you're humble, it's not that you think poorly of yourself necessarily, but rather you're not focused on yourself. You're focused on others. You're focused on other things. And ideally, you're focused on God. And so when God kind of like says, hey, let's look at you and let's think about you, and let's maybe put you in a position where you're going to have authority, or influence, rather, better word to say that, it throws you off, because you're like, hey, I wasn't even thinking about myself, right? So I think that's the key, and that kind of reveals a little bit more. Not to say that people who want authority are necessarily like, oh, you can't, right? Sometimes God places that desire in us, exactly, yeah. But it still needs humility. It still takes humility in order to be a good leader, I believe. It kind of reminds me of the story, I believe it's found in Matthew 20, where James and John, two of the disciples of Jesus, sons of thunder, their mom comes to Jesus and says, hey, Jesus, can you do me a favor? Kind of like takes him aside, like, hey, when you become, the king, the idea of the messianic figure that would overtake the Romans, can you have one of my sons sit on your right, the other one on your left? I mean, you love them, right? Like, hey, just do that for me. And Jesus is like, well, the Father's the one that decides. They're actually going to drink the cup that I'm going to drink off. They're going to die for their faith. But I can't do that. And later the disciples find out, and they're upset. And Jesus says, the Gentiles and the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, but it's not going to be the same thing among you. The parallel text in Luke, I believe, is 22 verse 25, or 26 rather, you shall not be like them. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who leads like the one who serves. In other words, Jesus continues the theme that he does of flipping it around. If you want to be the greatest, you must become the least.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of exemplified in the film with the character of Pope Francis, or Bergoglio, whereas, you see all the other cardinals dressed up in pomposity. I'm not sure how cardinals live normally, but they make it seem as though Bergoglio lives in let's say lower quality of life than
simpler life, maybe?
A simpler life. He lives a simpler life than what is expected of a cardinal of his stature.
Mm-hmm. And even when he becomes the Pope at the end of the film, they're like, here are your golden shoes? And he's like, oh, my shoes are fine. He's like his common regular shoes. And they look at him like, what? And it's like, okay, here's this like robe or something they're gonna put on him, and he's like, actually, I'm good the way I am. And so they're kind of shocked. The attendants of the Pope are kind of shocked that he would not continue the tradition.
Not only the attendants, but the Pope himself is shocked of such
extravagance.
I guess. But yes, in fact, he has a lot of controversy. He has a lot of disagreements with the Pope on such things.
With the previous Pope, right? With
Benedict.
With
Benedict. Yeah, there seems to be a lot of tension between them on matters like those of like how to live, how to I'm gonna say rule the church, how to lead the church.
Yeah.
Better said. There's a lot of that's what most of their conversations are about. In fact, I think the first conversations, the first maybe 2 or 3 conversations they have are simply about how they disagree on matters of fundamentalism, how they disagree in matters of leading on public welfare and stuff like that. And I think throughout the film, we start to, at least with Bergoglio, we start to see how his life has been transforming him into this person and how he got to this point. Because he tells the story, maybe towards the end of the film, of his experience when Argentina was going through a period of great civil unrest, when there was this oppressive government who was persecuting a lot of people, and he wanted to protect his people. I think there was a Jesuit mission.
Yeah, the Jesuits, priests underneath his care.
Exactly, and he was trying to protect them, telling them to back off, but they wanted to continue doing their ministry. They wanted to continue doing good in their community, so they didn't stop, and they were ultimately arrested, tortured, they died as well. And we see that Bergoglio feels guilt. He feels remorse. And I found it interesting that it seems that they communicate the idea that Bergoglio lives such a simple and such a giving life as a way of him making penance for his mistakes, for not being there, for not living up to the standard of Christ during that very dark time.
And taking up the cause of his fallen brothers, right? He kind of says that I kind of kept going after he was exiled, from his position as the Jesuit leader. And they're like sent to a village. He kind of says in the movie that he continues the work that they had been doing in his own context. And it's fascinating because in the movie, Bergoglio is personified. He's shown as a very relatable person. He's very good with people. He talks to the gardener and like talks about, oh, my mom used to cook with the same spices and stuff like that. And then also at the end, when he is the Pope, there's a moment when he's like, where's the Wi-Fi password? He's talking to one of the Swiss guards. Like, what's how to get on Wi-Fi or whatever? And the guard's
I think he asked him, do you know how to book a plane from here to I don't know where?
Yes. And the Swiss guard is like thrown off, and he takes out his own phone, which is so funny in itself because he's dressed in these garbs from, like, who knows, the 1600s, who knows? And then he pulls out a phone from like, oh yeah, this is how you do it. I love that. I love that scene. But it shows kind of the Pope Bergoglio is very relatable, very personable, and Ratzinger more just kind of traditional, right? The music that he listens to is more traditional. The things that he follows within the church are more traditional.
I think the first interaction they have is where Bergoglio is humming something in the bathroom of the Vatican.
Yes. And ABBA, right?
Yes. No, but Ratzinger asks him, what are you listening to? And expecting him to say Bach or, Verdi.
No, it's like a hymn. He asks him like, what hymn are you singing or whatever?
What hymn is that? And he says, Dancing Queen.
and Ratzinger's like completely thrown off. He's like, what?
So yeah, I think that sets up their relationship, their dynamic so well.
And this leads to another theme that we wanted to touch on, which is kind of this theme of, in some cases, people usually name it this way. This is the terminology that they use, which is liberal versus conservative. Some people don't like that terminology, but we'll use that for our purposes here. What do you think about that tension in the church, whether it's the Catholic Church, the Adventist Church, maybe a different church? How do we deal with this? And what do you think is a good way moving forward? Maybe not the best way, because that would be maybe a little arrogant of us, but a good way moving forward, understanding both sides of the spectrum.
I think, well, this is not only a religious issue. I think we can see this even in this country right now. This is election year. We see this great dichotomy and this great war, it seems, between, liberalists and fundamentalists politically. And this even extends to our church. In the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we have this big dichotomy between conservatives and liberals. So I think this movie exemplifies a great way, a great way to approach this dichotomy, in the sense that you see these two people who are so politically and so ideologically different, who can still find a way to have a decent conversation and to talk calmly about these issues.
And that's huge, right?
Exactly. And at the beginning, you kind of see like how they're kind of like taking jabs at each other. How Ratzinger's getting all riled up, and Bergoglio's saying like these very like extreme, like what might be to Ratzinger extremist things, and so they get kind of like heated at each other. But as they grow in their friendship and their relationship, their conversations are more humble. Like they have a more humble attitude towards each other. Like, let's actually talk as two human beings. Let's recognize our differences and let's just talk this out. And I think at the end, it demonstrates that both of them were humble enough to give the other person a voice, basically. Where Ratzinger, at the end, he accepts and he welcomes Bergoglio as the new pope.
Yes.
Even though he espouses a different ideology from him, he supports him and he thinks that God is leading him towards the position. And in another sense, Bergoglio also, even he lives an extremely humble lifestyle, he still has to accept some of the, the things he may not agree with in the Vatican.
Right.
So I think it demonstrates how human beings that have different opinions, that have different ideologies, can come together, talk it out, not necessarily come to a compromise, but, just live in harmony with each other and be okay with each other without having to demonize the other person.
Yeah, man, I love that. And I love that about this movie. The fact that it shows how two people apparently opposite can find a common goal. But not only that, but can also become vulnerable with one another, see beyond like an ideology. A lot of times we label people based on what they believe, and we forget about their humanity and we forget about their story. And this movie takes for a lot of the time, the perspective of Bergoglio, right? That you see a lot more into his story in Argentina and how he became a priest and how he's been led into this point. But still, even though you kind of relate to him more, Ratzinger is not portrayed as someone who is an antagonist. On the other hand, through the movie, as you kind of understand more about where he's coming from, how he was raised, through the conversations, when he becomes vulnerable and he confesses, to Bergoglio, you have these moments of vulnerability, and so things start to change. And I think that's the moment where, as an audience watching the film, you begin to sense like, hey, this is a kind of false dichotomy. Like both of them have similar things that are going on, and they can coexist in harmony. And as a matter of fact, maybe they need to coexist in harmony because you need both the traditional side and the, if you want to call it this way, progressive side for the institution to succeed. And so I love that vulnerability aspect.
Yes, it shows that human beings are so much more than our ideologies.
Yes.
We are human beings. We all have flaws. We all have strengths. And I think this movie just shows that in such a beautiful way.
Well, let's segue a little bit because
Okay,
one of the things that kind of brings these two together is trying to hear God's voice, right? Like God hasn't spoken to me, Ratzinger says, but then he says later that I feel like God has been telling me, to let you take over, right? In this time for the church, to Bergoglio. But Bergoglio also talks about listening to God's voice in key moments of his life, when he became a priest, when he was very closely aligned with the dictatorship in Argentina, then later on towards the closer events of the present of the movie, so to speak.
Yeah.
How do we hear God's voice?
I think it's a great question, and I think this is something that we can all relate to as Christians.
Yeah.
Then I think this is a question that everybody has, and everybody can not come to a conclusive answer. How do I know that this voice telling me that I should do this is God's voice?
There is no cookie cutter way, I would say. And even in the movie, both of their stories are different. There's not a cookie cutter way that God speaks to both of them.
Basically, we see the pattern that the way that Bergoglio senses that God is speaking to him is through other people. Because when he is deciding to become, whether to follow a career and have a wife and a family, or to become a priest, he asks for a sign from God, and then he's walking down and he goes by the church, and the priest tells him, "Come to confession."
Right.
and then he goes in, and that he took it as a sign from God. And when he's also when he goes to present his
resignation
letter to the Pope, and the Pope is like, "Oh, let me confess to you."
Right.
It's kind of like, it's an inverse right there, It's like first he was confessing, now he's being confessed to.
Yeah.
And but he basically hears the voice of God through other people.
And through spiritual people,
exactly. And I think that's a way that God can speak to us as well. Sometimes God speaks through us, through our mentors, through pastors, through our parents. God uses people sometimes to lead us into the situations he wants us in. But we also see not the opposite, we see a different way of God speaking in the character of Ratzinger. Because how does Ratzinger hear God's voice, do you think?
It seems as if Ratzinger was getting impressions from God, right? Through the events that were happening, in his term as a pope, he was getting impressions after he had been asking for God to speak to him for a while. And he was kind of at first rejecting those impressions and saying, no, this can't be it. But they kind of kept getting stronger and stronger. So I think sometimes the Holy Spirit can speak to us with impressions. He puts it in your heart. Hey, I'm calling you to this. And a lot of times it's not one way or the other. Maybe some spiritual people will speak into your life and say, hey, I've sensed this, and maybe this is something that you need to consider. And it goes along with the impressions that you're given. But it seems that Ratzinger was led more by those impressions rather than by other people speaking to him the way that Bergoglio felt God's voice in his life.
Because if he would listen to the opinion of other people, when Bergoglio hands him his resignation letter, he would take that. If he really didn't listen to that voice or those impressions and listen to other people instead. Because the guy who you're receiving impressions about is telling you that he's resigning.
Right.
You would take that as a definite sign from God.
You could, yes.
But that's not the way that he feels God is speaking to him. In his way. So I think each one of us has different ways in which God speaks to us. Sometimes it's through circumstances, through impressions, through other people. Some people may actually receive, visions and dreams about things.
Or direct, or hear the voice of God, or very direct in interventions by God in their life. Also, I think something that's very important to highlight is the Bible. God can speak through us through his word. I mean, the Bible itself says that about itself, right? That God uses that. It's God breathed, and it's useful to us for instruction and for correction and for training in righteousness. So the Bible itself can be a way, and a lot of times is a way that God speaks to us. Dido, let me ask you a personal question. How did you feel the call, so to speak, to become a pastor?
For me, it was through circumstances,
Hmm.
in the sense that I really, how do I explain it? The way things happened kept like it felt like the circumstances, like God closed certain doors, He opened others, in where it was apparent that He was saying, okay, this is the way, basically.
I see what you did there. Little Mandalorian.
Yes, but
Slide that in.
that's basically, it's like I wanted to study something else. I didn't want to study religion, but then that possibility was closed, and then we were gonna move to this somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And what was I gonna study there? And then basically also through previous experiences and through my own, I guess, inclinations,
Mm-hmm.
that's where I came to the decision, and I felt the call of God.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite different for like a lot of other pastors, a lot of
Yeah.
other people who study religion, where they felt that moment where God is like, you're gonna become a pastor, you're gonna be this, you're gonna be that.
Right. That's kind of my experience.
Yeah. Okay. So
So-
tell us about that.
Similar in some similarities to yours in the fact that I also wanted to do something completely different. My whole life I was convinced I was going to become a physician, a doctor, medical doctor. And my first weekend in college, literally, even though people had told me in high school, like, you're going to be a pastor, and I was rejecting it, during a sermon, someone talking about their own call to ministry, I got the impression maybe you should go into ministry. And I was rejecting it. No. And then that person, Dwight Nelson, the pastor here at PMC, pointed at me and said, "Yes, you're gonna be a preacher," and just kept on going. Never, he didn't
So
know
for
me.
you, Dwight Nelson was the voice of God.
That is a very dangerous statement, but I think God used Dwight Nelson in that moment to affirm something that he had been working in my life, but I was very blind to because I was so set on becoming a medical doctor.
Okay.
And so I did have like a specific moment that I can point to where God was like, boom, very clearly, because I'm hard-headed and stubborn, like, yes, this is for you. And so this is the way. And Monday morning, I switched my major and switched to religion. So
That's awesome. So yeah, is there anything else you wanted to talk about regarding this film?
well, there's a quote that I really like in the film. But actually, I just want to briefly touch on a theme in this movie, kind of with grace by the theme. And if you're not familiar with this, you may have missed it, but it's the idea of liberation theology. And I'm in no sense an expert on this, but is this, during the last century, the end of the last century, we find, especially in Latin American countries, this theology of liberation where Jesus becomes the liberator of the oppressed and is particularly interested in the poorest of the poor in society. And so he's seeking to, and then also it is the job of the theologian, right? Or the priest or of the clergy, whatever, of the spirit, the religious, to help Jesus kind of in this liberation of the very worst of society.
Okay.
And so there's mixed reviews on this. There's a lot of controversy behind this idea. I think it's great. I think, God calls us to be socially active. We see that through the Old Testament. We see that in Timothy, or James rather. Anyway, I guess in both you could see that. You can make an argument for that. But the problem with liberation theology that some people point out is the Marxist ideology that kind of blended into it.
Okay.
And so, anyway, it's just very fascinating because you have in the Argentinians flashbacks, you kind of have snippets of this where, some of these priests were very active politically and socially in order to bring about change. And I guess that leads me into, how do we as Christians, and this is a question that I've seen in more recent times, how do we engage in the political spectrum or realm? What is our role as Christians, as followers of Jesus, when it comes to, politics?
Yeah. Well, I think we've talked about this in some sense on previous episodes, particularly with Just Mercy.
Right.
What is our role in addressing social injustice?
Unashamed plug. Go listen to the podcast.
Definitely. Oh wow. So I don't remember my answer that I gave then, and I can't really think of a conclusive answer now. What I will say is that whenever we see injustice happening in our world, and whether it's on a global scale, whether it's on a national scale, when it's on a local scale, we should always speak up against oppression, against injustices.
Right.
And I think, just like we talk about how God leads us in different directions, in different ways, we have different ways of enacting change in our world. I think for some people who are politically inclined, okay, it's perhaps they have that gift, God has given them that calling to enact social change through politics. For other people, it may be, by directly serving the community, by giving, giving food to people who can't afford, giving help to whoever they come across, and starting and volunteering with programs and with churches and organizations to help people. Some people maybe maybe their way of speaking up against will be through social media, through journalism, through writing and stuff like that. So I think there's different ways in which we can address, and I cannot tell you that you should or you should not be addressing these issues through politics.
I think we have talked about this, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I'm glad that we kind of got this plug for another episode. I will say there's a theme that we haven't talked on, and it's goes along these same lines, and that's the separation of church and state as a religious liberty. Some people parallel that, and this is a biblical idea, and not also a biblical idea, but also we've seen in history when the church and the state have become joined and become one, where the church holds the sword, so to speak. There is a lot of problems, right? Because it goes against something that God gives people, which is the ability to choose whether or not they're going to accept Him. When the church holds the power of the government, it tends to take away that choice. And so, anyway, it's just something to think about. As we engage in the political sphere, be careful not to impose your beliefs on others, because that is not the way that Jesus would do things.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think that's something that should also be clarified. But if we get involved in politics, that doesn't mean that it is our place to impose on others our belief system, basically. But simply we can use those platforms to address, injustice issues, to address issues of oppression sometimes.
And there's still evangelism. So you can still invite people to follow Jesus, but doesn't mean that like, hey, I'm going to hold a gun to your head unless you follow Jesus. Like there's a difference there. There's a difference.
Or another way of putting this is also do not hinder people from believing what they believe, basically. Respecting everybody's personal space and their own beliefs as well. I think that's also a great part. And I think something that can be in some kind of way touched upon in this film as well. Respecting the beliefs of others, even when you are sharing your own beliefs.
Agreed. And I think they portray this very brilliantly because they both, Bergoglio and Ratzinger both share their views in conversations, in dialogue. And there were some heated moments, but ultimately they were willing to have those discussions and listen to the other side. And I think that's vital. Yeah. So what about you? Is there like a final thought that maybe you want to just leave us with or something?
Well, I think this thing that we just ended on is a very good way to end. Basically, this film, what this film is to me is how we can address different issues, having different points of view, but still recognizing each other as human beings.
That's a great way to end. I love that.
I want to say the my favorite part of this movie is actually the ending, because they sit down and watch the Argentina versus Germany final. And they're both, one is Argentinian, the other was German, and it's just so, I don't know, I find it so wholesome.
It was wholesome, and there's like the slight trash talk, right, that's going on between both of them. Even Ratzinger, who is not a soccer fan, that was rich.
We're talking about that, sometimes political views can align themselves with sports as well, and someone who is so dogmatic, so passionate about our sports teams. And then sometimes sports rivalries become like political issues where people are willing to.
Yeah, they feel so strongly about.
Yeah, and they're willing
views.
to beat other people over it and stuff. But also we can also get together. We can root for different teams and have a good time.
I like that. There's a quote that I really like in the movie. I almost forgot.
Okay.
Bergoglio says this: "Truth may be vital, but without love, it is unbearable."
Amen.
And I think that's just brilliant on the part of the writers. I hope you said that in real life, because that is amazing.
It is an amazing quote. Also, I want to end also with a disclaimer. By us reviewing this movie, we are not endorsing the values of Catholicism.
Guys, we're not secret Jesuits. Please don't message us and saying, "Oh wow, you guys are infiltrated," because it's not true.
Thank you. And I think with that, we can sign off. This is until next time.
All right, see you guys then.